All right, friends, let's get started. Welcome to the Laing Lectures. We're delighted to have you here for our first gathering of this sort for the Laing Lectures in person since 2020. 2019. So we're very excited about that. So welcome to all of you who are here with us on campus and also to those who are joining us online as well. My name is Paul Spilsbury. I'm the Academic Dean and Professor of New Testament here at Regent, and I will be your MC and moderator this evening. We're delighted that you've joined us for the 2023 edition of the Laing Lectures. These lectures have been a highlight of our year here at Regent ever since they began in 1999. The lectureship is made possible by the generous support of Roger and Carol Laing, in honor of Roger's father, Bill Laing, a much-loved and influential pastor of Bethel Baptist Church in Calgary, Alberta. So please do take the time to look at your brochure where you can see more information about Pastor Laing at the back of the brochure. And we're particularly, as always, pleased that Roger is with us today, along with his brother Rolly, who is also a long-standing friend of Regent College. Welcome. The purpose of the Laing Lectures is to encourage individuals recognized for their scholarship, wisdom, and creativity to undertake serious study and writing on an issue of significance for the Christian church, and to promote the sharing of such study through a series of public lectures and their subsequent publication. And I'm certain that you will find this year's lectures fully to meet these criteria, and we invite you to engage deeply with the ideas and insights that will be presented here this evening and tomorrow as well. Before going any further, let me just share a couple of housekeeping items for all of our comfort. First of all, please take the time right now to turn off your cell phone and other beeping devices that you may have with you. I'd also ask that you not record the lecture. Both of the evening lectures are being recorded and will be available for sale through the Regent College bookstore. There's also a session in addition to the two evening sessions. There's also an afternoon session tomorrow, which will be an interview conducted by Dr. Ewan Russell Jones, and that will also include Q&A. That event will not be live streamed. It will be in person only. This evening, after the session, Dr. Thompson will be available in the Regent bookstore to sign books, although I'm told that there's not that many that have arrived. So try not to stampede, but just throw that out there. So the format for the evening, well, the lecture will run approximately 60 minutes, and that will then be followed by time for your questions. And so I would invite you to one of the two mics. There's one over there and one over there. And you can prepare your questions in advance for that. And for those who are online, please email your question to questions@regent-college.edu, and those will find their way to the front as well. Okay, now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce this year's Laing lecturer. Dr. Curt Thompson holds an MD from Wright State University School of Medicine. He completed his psychiatric residency at Temple University Hospital in Philadelphia. He's certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. He is the founder of Being Known, an organization that develops resources for hope and healing at the intersection of neuroscience and Christian spiritual formation. He is also the author of numerous works, including The Soul of Shame, The Soul of Desire, and The Anatomy of the Soul. Dr. Thompson's work brings together interpersonal neurobiology and a Christian anthropology to educate and encourage individuals as they seek to fulfill their intrinsic desire to feel known, valued, and connected. His unique insights about how the brain affects the process and processes relationships, help people discover a fresh perspective and practical applications to foster healthy and vibrant lives, allowing them to get unstuck and move toward the next beautiful thing they're being called to make. Curt and his wife Phyllis live outside of Washington, D.C., and they have 2 adult children. We're so glad to be hosting Dr. Thompson at Regent College this year. Please join me now as we welcome him to the podium.
Well, my goodness, first of all, thank you for coming. I mean, for actually coming here. I bring you greetings from your friends and neighbors to the south, and I also want to thank Roger and thank Paul and thank all the entire Regent family for your kind invitation. I've been wanting to come to Regent for probably the better part of 25 years. Not as a speaker, I mean, but I'm all the things that you hear about Regent, at least that I've heard about it. And I'm just so grateful to be here and to be here with you, and especially to be able to leave our nation's capital and come here. I tell people, as you may know, I'm a practicing psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., which the good news is I know I'll never be out of a job, which is advantageous. And it's, but this is not necessarily good news for everybody, but it's not bad news for me. So thank you for inviting me to come, and especially given that one of my best friends, best man at my wedding, Jeff Dudiak, who's a professor of philosophy at the King's University in Alberta. I feel like I'm just so much closer to him, even though I'm not that close at all, even though I'm much closer to him. So on to the business at hand. This evening and tomorrow night, there is this title that you see, Neuroscience and the Beauty, Trauma, and Renewal of All Things. And between tonight and tomorrow, there's going to be a 2-part offering. And tonight, we're going to talk about the first couple of items, this notion of beauty and trauma and the impact that trauma has. And then tomorrow night, we're going to talk about what do we mean by renewal of all these things. And interspersed throughout all of this is going to be some conversation about neuroscience and what we mean by it, the role that it plays, what it actually constitutes, and so forth. But before any of that, the thing that I think that is most important for us, that I would long for us to know, is that I like to tell folks, when we're dealing with patients, anxiety is a function of time. You may be like, anxiety is a matter of future state. If I'm worried because of things that are coming. So it's my brain is anticipating something in the future, whether it's 5 seconds from now, 5 minutes, 5 weeks from now. It's a future state issue. And so the more able I am to be in the present moment, the more physiologically I disable anxiety from being part of my life. And so I want to invite us to consider actually being here for the time that we're here. And I also just want to acknowledge that it's hard to do. It's hard to be in the present moment because we have a world that ever since the 3rd page of the Bible has been asking us to be someplace else other than where we actually are. Most of us actually spend most of our mental energy being someplace else, either in our pasts, whether it's 5 seconds or 5 minutes ago, or in our futures, rather than where we actually exist. And because I'm not there, in the only space I ever actually occupy, I tend to be more anxious. And the more anxious I am, the less able I am to be as fully creative as I have been made to be. So I want to invite us to consider that we be here. And to also give ourselves a break and recognize that when you wander off someplace else, which some of you already are doing, I see it. I'm a psychiatrist. I've been trained to know these things. Before you know it, it's all just going to be one big group therapy session tonight. it's not easy to do this. And here's something else that's not easy to do. It is not easy to follow the King. It's hard to follow Jesus. At least it is for me. And so one of the other reasons that I'm really grateful for being here is that it's really meaningful for me to be in a room where there are other people who know that it's hard to do this work. It is the most beautiful, most durable work we will ever do, and it is also work of which there is nothing harder to do. But as we like to say, the brain can do a lot of really hard things for a long time, as long as it doesn't have to do it by itself. And you're going to hear that refrain from me over and over again as we talk about the items at hand. So let me start with this reflection, and that is that we as human beings, above anything else, are people of great longing. We are people of great desire. Some of you may be familiar with the work of René Girard, French Catholic theologian and philosopher, who writes persuasively about mimetic desire, this notion that I am a person of great longing, but I don't just long just because of myself. I long because I long for what you long for. I mimic this. I see what other people want, and I want these things. And this is based on what we would say now have a lot to do with things that we would call mirror neurons in the brain and other things that we will talk over and again about in the time that we're here. But I want to acknowledge that we are people of great desire. And that desire actually begins somatically. That desire begins with physical appetites. A newborn comes into the world, and she wants things, right? She wants to be fed. She wants to be clothed. She wants all these things that he wants too. We are a longing people. We long for these things developmentally. We don't even have to talk about the Bible yet, but we'll get there. But developmentally, we are a longing people. But eventually, we notice, and this happens within hours, even to days and weeks, that there's something beyond just appetites, just physical appetites for which we long. We long for at least 4 things that we all need that begin when we are newborns and they never end. The first thing that we long for is we long to be seen. We like to say that every baby comes into the world looking for someone looking for her, looking for someone looking for him, and it never stops. You will be 82 and you will be going to your grave, and the people who are with you, you will still want them to be looking at you, looking at them, coming for you, until you transfer your gaze to Jesus coming for you. We're looking for someone. I want to be deeply seen. And I don't just mean seen just my physicality. I want you to see deep within my soul. I don't even know that I want that, but that is what we eventually come to know is true about who we are. I want to be seen, but I don't just want to be seen. I also long to be soothed. This is the second S word, the soothed. And of course, because we know that if you have a baby that comes into the world and you put her on the steel table, if she's not soothed, she's going to die. This is something else that we all long for, and we will long for it until we're dead. You will notice the questions that are already starting to germinate within our own minds. By whom am I being seen now? By whom do I long to be seen? But I'm not being seen by them. There are people, is anybody here, I know the two of you are married. Is anybody here married to each other, married to somebody else in the room? And you came with them. I'm pleased to know that. Right, so we know that even in marriages, people, good marriages, we long for parts of us to be seen by the other that are just simply not yet seen. We long to be seen in order to be comforted, in order to be soothed, because there is so much about the human mind that is in distress for which soothing is necessary. This is the next question. What are the parts of our lives for which we long to be soothed, but we first have to be seen in order for that to happen? Is it within my workspace? Is it the part of my medical condition? Is it the ache that I have because I have a father who, though long deceased, I know will never love me. The list is long of ways in which we need soothing. But I don't just want to be seen in order to be soothed. I also then develop a certain sense of longing to be safe. Now, by safe, I will say right off the top that the word safe now routinely is misappropriated in the West, at least in the English language. When I say I'm safe, to say I don't feel safe is a euphemism for there's something I don't want to do. Are you with me? Right? I don't feel safe in this classroom, in this setting, in the whatever this is. I don't feel safe. Now, there are other ways to say this, things like I'm afraid, but when I want safety, I want to know that I'm actually being protected from things that are outside of my skin. This is happening, again, for newborns and toddlers alike, right? Children have to be saved from their environment. So we clothe them, we feed them, we put a roof over their heads, we make sure that they're safe. But we also want to know that they are safe from us as adults. We also want to protect them from our harshness. We want to protect them from our brutality. We want to protect them from our violence. We want to protect those from things that are outside their skin. But there is another way in which we also need to be protected, and that is, as a toddler, I have to actually be made safe from me. I have things within me that I will do if you don't have me stop doing them. I will run into traffic. I will hit my brother or sister over and over and over again because they deserve it, right? These are the things that I will do. And so there are a lot of parts of who we are as human beings that come from within us, for which we also need to restrain. And we have to work to keep that from endangering other people and then myself as well. But it's important to know that being safe does not mean I never have injury. There's a difference. To be safe means I'm comfortable and confident in the world that I occupy. I can be a 3-year-old and I'm running around in the kitchen, I slip, fall, and cut my eye on the kitchen counter. This does not make me unsafe in my house. This makes me a 3-year-old. That's what it makes me. And so safety means I can be comfortable and confident in the world that I occupy. It does not mean there is never any danger. It does not mean that I never have any problems. It simply means that even in the space where things that are difficult can happen, I can continue to remain comfortable and confident. I can be safe. Now here we're at a point where what we're really talking about in terms of human development also includes another part of research in neuroscience that has to do with attachment. Because to be seen and soothed and safe requires the presence of other adult brains being in the room that are going to take care of this small one. And it's not just a matter of a homogeneous thing called a brain being with the other homogeneous thing called a brain for the child, but in fact, that child's brain has lots of different things that are happening to it. In fact, in the world of interpersonal neurobiology, we like to talk about this as a feature of integration. This notion that the mind, as we define it, is this embodied and relational process that emerges from within and between brains whose task it is to regulate the flow of energy and information. You have that? You got that definition of the mind? Okay, we'll do this again, okay? That the mind is first embodied, right? My mind is not something that is just in my brain. If you're anxious, how do you know that you're anxious? You feel it in your abdomen. You feel it in your hands. Like if I'm anxious, I know it because I have a body. So my mind also doesn't just include my brain, it includes my body as well. I'm an embodied relational being. When a newborn comes into the world, of her 100 billion neurons, about 15 to 20% of them are ready to go, are ready to do what they need to do in order for them to fire normally and naturally. The other 80 to 85% of those neurons, in order for them to do what they will need to do eventually, require the interaction of that baby with another human being. No pressure. But there is this clear sense that if the baby's mind is going to develop, it requires a relational interaction in order for that to take place. And so in the same way that the baby's mind, her brain and her body, with all of these distinct parts, we sense, we image, we feel, we think, we behave with our physicality, all of those different parts For them to become connected in the mind of that newborn, she also equally has to be connected to another human being. What's happening within me is always a function of what's happening between me and you. In this way, we would say that integration is not unlike an orchestra. An orchestra has lots of different parts, different sections. We sense, we image, we feel. We have timpani, we have strings, we have brass. And each section needs to be well developed. Anybody here grew up in a house where emotion was not paid that much attention to? Or everybody from Canada has people who I didn't know emotion was a thing here. Okay. I grew up in a house where I think this was a standard parenting procedure for people who grew up in Ohio. That's where I grew up, in Ohio. Have anybody here heard the phrase, or maybe this has not been exported from the U.S. yet to other places, I want you to stop your crying or I'm going to give you something to cry about. You ever hear that phrase? This is like universal. I'm sure that they speak this in French. They say the same thing in some way, shape, or form, right? Which now, the logic notwithstanding, that doesn't work, right? You think about it. Stop your crying, or I'm going to be something you need to cry about, but I'm not supposed to be crying. Like as a 4-year-old, I'm trying to have a conversation with my father. Is this really making sense? No, it's not making a lot of sense. But there is the sense in which I grew up in a family in which my father, a God-fearing man, a beautiful man, but he was somebody that you just didn't want to piss off. You just didn't want to, he had the presence. And he was not an angry guy because we were all working so hard to make sure he wasn't. And I had a mother, again, deeply committed follower of Jesus, who functionally was an orphan growing up. She was 3 years old when she lost her mother to an ectopic pregnancy complication. She had 4 older siblings. Her father, though well-educated and well-heeled, was not able to keep his children in his house, sent them all out. She eventually landed at the home of an aunt who unfortunately also was plagued by a waxing and waning condition of bipolar disorder. And there would be times when my mother would wake up in the morning and her mom would just be gone because she'd been toted off to the hospital. And she would come back weeks or months later. My mother's oldest brother, when he was in his 40s, hanged himself, found by his son, who when he was in his 40s repeated it. Now, my mother had reason to be anxious. Now, she loved Jesus, but she was anxious. And so I learned, growing up, that there were certain parts of the emotional state of being human that you just work really hard to make sure don't come into the room. You make sure nobody's anxious in the room, and you make sure nobody's angry. And I got really good at starting my psychiatric training when I was 4 years old. Because you see what happens. We have these different elements of our orchestra that simply don't get developed. Are you with me? But we can have other kinds of conditions as well in which people are just running ransack all over your emotional states in the family in which you grew up. So we have ranges of different ways, and when these kinds of things happen, these shape the attachment processes of those of us who are growing up in our houses. And these attachment processes shape everything that there is about what we do in life. They shape all of our relationships. They shape how we work. They shape where we choose to go to work. They shape how we lead. They shape how we follow. But more so than that, they also are shaped by certain things that are taking place in the brain that either do or don't get much practice that they need. For example, there is a thing called the social engagement system in the brain. And the social engagement system is a network of neurons that are both in the brain and in the body, and they are primitive when you come into the world as a newborn. But when they do start to get activated because they're interacting with other people, they become the way that I most effectively regulate my emotional states. We like to say that the brain is one big affect regulation machine. There's nothing that you do that is not a function of regulating your affect, regulating your emotion. It's like we say emotion for the human being is like fuel in the tank of a car. whether that's gasoline or whether that's battery power. Now, there's nothing that you do with a car that doesn't have something to do with a function of fuel regulation. You turn it on, you turn it off, you speed it up, you slow it down, you turn it, you back it up, so forth and so on. Fuel regulation is part of what's going on. Affect regulation is going on all the time. Now, here's the thing. We don't build cars just to have a place to put gasoline. It's not because emotion is the most important thing, it's just that it's always in play. And part of our challenge is that many of us are paying no attention to that fact. And our affect is actually regulating us rather than the other way around. And this shows up in all of our relationships. It shows up then in terms of how we study, in terms of what we choose to study. All kinds of things are part of this way of developing secure attachment. We like to say that attachment itself is a way in which the newborn brain, its underdeveloped, immature self, accesses the hopefully, more mature adult brain in order to help organize itself. That's what that newborn is doing. And we continue to do this even into our adult relationships. This is all part of what it means to be seen, soothed, and made to be safe. But there's a fourth S. And that fourth S is secure. Now, these four words, seen, soothed, safe, secure, were coined by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson some time ago. And when you get to this word secure, they and I kind of diverge in what we talk about. Because when we talk about security, with a mind that is secure, we mean that because we have been seen and we're soothed and we're safe, we now are able to leave that space and go and take proper risks in life. We can go and make mistakes. We can go and try new challenges. We can do all kinds of things in which we are longing to make things, which we're going to come back to in just a moment. We want to be on adventure. We might get our noses bloodied, we might get our knees scraped, we might get our feelings hurt. But we will always be in a position where we can learn to repair ruptures because we come back to places where we are seen, soothed, and safe. But it is out of that space that we then go on to be people of security, primarily because we will always know that there are relationships to which we can return when the going gets rough. Are you with me? This is all fundamental elements of what it means to develop secure attachment, and the brain, like the orchestra, is developing right along with it. And here's where we pause and we would say, interestingly enough, when you look at the very first page of the Bible, we see very similar things. How so? The first thing that you see on the first page of the Bible is that God, if anything else, like the Hebrew writers are brilliant in that they're like good movie makers, right? They don't explain everything, they just show you things. When you open up the first page of the Bible, we see that what God is doing and who he is that he's an artist. He's making things. Like it's like you turn the TV on and the movie's already playing and there he is, and he's making things. Now notice, there is a certain way in which he goes about making things from the very first thing you read. In the beginning, the Lord God formed the heavens and the earth was formless, void, chaotic, and a wind of the Spirit of God hovered as it swept over the waters. In every single Near Eastern ancient creation narrative, before the God who ends up making the things, makes the things, that God first goes to war. That God has some kind of violent act in which the God must act things out before he then settles down to create humankind. The Hebrews come along, and what do we see? We see a God who is not at war with the creation. He is a God who hovers. Are you with me? This is the beginning of secure attachment. This is what parents do. Parents hover. We hover. We're not anxious. We're not irritated. We're hovering. We're not at war with our children. But I would dare say that many of us in this room know what it means to grow up in a house where people were at war. Sometimes the wars were silent. Are you with me? But war was what we knew. We didn't necessarily know hovering, but this is the God of the Hebrews. He's hovering. And then here's the other thing that's just so fascinating to me. That God does not just say, let there be the world. Notice, he could have done that. Like, let there be the world. Like, why do you need 6 days? Like, that dude is so lazy. Why can't you just do this all at once? Why? That was kind of funny, wasn't it? Yeah, just lazy. Right. I think you think so. Okay. All right. He's like, no. He's an artist. He does day one. And even with day one, there is this dance of light and darkness. And then day two, and waters above and waters below. And day three, you separate the waters from the land. There is this rhythmic, interlocking integration, if you will, a differentiation of different parts that are linked together, not unlike the way the mind works. Not only that, he gets to the very end of the first page of the Bible, and he gets to us. And then there is this moment where God does something very different. One would have thought that if you were going to follow the pattern of the first 25 verses that you read on the first page of the Bible, that you would get to verse 26, and it would go something like this. And God said, let there be mankind, and there was mankind. No, right? But notice, no, God reflects. The Elohim, he calls a council, right? This is the Elohim. He calls a council of the gods, and he says, let's do this. The God who sees Good Friday coming says, let's do this. Moreover, let's make them like us. Let's make them like us. So the first thing that we see is this is an artist who longs for things, and then he makes us to be people who long for things just like he does. And not only do we long for things, we long for things like God does. When we read in Ecclesiastes 3:11, for he has put eternity in their hearts, it's important to know the Hebrews didn't just talk about eternity in terms of time. They talk about it in terms of the quality of life with which God lives. The eternity that we have is not just a measure of time, it is a measure of depth, of longing for the kind of life that we want. The life of being seen, soothed, safe, and to be secure. And this leads us then to this next notion that if we are going to be like God, we are going to be making things. Because this is what God's doing on the very first page. If we're going to be like him, we're going to make stuff. Here's a question. What is the next new artifact of beauty that God wants to make with you? Now, this is also a developmental issue. 3-year-olds. Has anybody here parented a 3-year-old? You reluctantly raise your hands. Yes, okay, a three-year-old. And at some point, a 3-year-old, without even having to be told to do this, a 3-year-old is going to come into your house, into your kitchen, and they're going to show you the thing that they have made, yes? And when they show it to you, they expect you to respond with delight. In fact, they want you to put it on the refrigerator and invite the neighbors and charge them money. Toddlers do not have to be told to do this. They will do this because of several things. Number one, they can't help but make stuff because they're made in the image of the one who's made them. Number two, the thing that they've made is embodied. They bring you something. Now, that doesn't mean that's the only thing they make up. Like, they have imaginary friends, too, right? I'm sure that some of you in this room have imaginary friends that you're talking with. You and I can talk about that later. But they have imaginary friends, but at some point, these things become tangible. They become part of the material world, and they bring them to you because these things are also conduits for connecting them to you. They're not just about what they're making, because what they are making is you and them together. Are you with me? The artistic expressions that we have are not just standalone artifacts of beauty. They are those things that draw us to each other. And when we are drawn to, I mean, how many, like, you see a beautiful thing, about whatever it is, and you want to have your friend come and see it because the thing is now drawing you to your friend. Are you with me? And then you're with your friend, and then you want to go make more of the stuff. And this becomes this ever-emerging generative cycle that is the intention of the first page of the Bible. This beauty that we long for is not stuff of mediocrity. The children who bring you things, they don't want you to respond as if it's just middle-class stuff. Like, no, they want an A+ on their grade from this mud pie that they've just brought into your kitchen. This is what they long for. They are longing for this joy, this delight that they are looking for because they want to be seen, soothed, safe, and secure. They're taking risks. It's important for us to know anytime anybody makes anything, you make a record, you write a book, you write a paper. It is an act of creativity, and you are putting it out into the public sphere, and it's an act of vulnerability. Are you with me? Do anybody here have to write? Do you have to write papers here? Right. And what do you want? What do you want from your professor? You want well done. Even if you don't get the A, you want well done. Because this is what we are longing for. We are longing to be seen, soothed, safe, secure, in order to develop relationships with which we can then create beauty and goodness in the world. If you turn the page to page 2 of the Bible, then you see something additionally. You see, first of all, that when God starts to create humankind on page 2 of the Bible, he gets very intimate. We are not talking about a God who makes things from a distance. He's in the mud. And God took the mud, and he breathed the breath of life into the man's nostrils, and he became a living soul. Now notice, we are mud and we are breath, and without either one, we are nothing. We're not fully human. And this is important for us to know. Breath and mud are both important, but there is a sequence. And this is consistent with what happens to us in our embodied minds. Because when it comes to the brain, first we sense and then we make sense of what we sense. First we sense and then we make sense of what we sense. We are sensing things all the time. You have 8 senses, right? Here we go. Okay, your first 5 you know, right? They come to you from outside the world, right? All the things that come to the outside the world, and these are things that generally come and take up residence in the back part of your brain. But then you get a 6th sense. You sense what you're sensing inside your body. We call that interoception. All that's going on in your GI tract and your hollow organs, right? Your GI tract, your lungs, your heart. When you're anxious, where do you feel? You sense it, right? In your chest. You sense it like you have your stomach is upset. There is this sense in which your body is helping you sense the world from within inside yourself. So that when we say something like, I have a 6th sense, that's not just metaphor. Because my body inside is telling me something that it's not just sensing from the outside world. That leads to a 7th sense, that we, as far as we know, unless you're an animal in a C.S. Lewis novel, as far as we know, we are the only animals who do this, and we sense that we sense things. I am aware that I'm hearing something. I am aware that I am anxious. I'm ashamed, and that I'm ashamed that I am ashamed. And once we start to pay attention to these, and mind you, all these 7 senses, all these senses are happening whether you're paying attention to them or not. That's the real element here. How well am I paying attention to this? But that leads then to an 8th sense, and my 8th sense is I begin to sense what someone else is sensing. And by that, I don't just mean that I sense that you feel distressed. I get particular about this. I have the sense that you're sad. I have the sense that you're worried. I have the sense that you're angry. And I can even think about why you might be angry. I'm sensing all kinds of things, but here's part of the challenge. I can't sense that very easily or very well if I have not had much practice with anyone else sensing these things in me. Remember the orchestra metaphor. Every orchestra, if it's going to do well in the world, it needs a conductor, right? You can have musicians that are really good at what they do, but if you don't have a conductor that brings them to where they need to be, where not only that they're doing well with their music, but they're listening to the other sections in the orchestra, if you don't have that, you don't have an orchestra. And for the human being, anatomically, the conductor lives at the front part of your brain, in your prefrontal cortex. But every conductor, every one of our prefrontal cortices, if it's going to do its job well, it actually has to go to conductor school. And for us, conductor school is the development of a secure attachment with someone else who's coming to make sure that I'm seen, soothed, safe, secure. My prefrontal cortex, in order for it to do well, so that I can be aware of my 8 senses, in order to create beauty and goodness in the world, in order for that to happen, I have to have an ongoing relationship with other human beings who are allowing me to have that same experience. We human beings can't give what we don't have. In order for me to love well, I can only do that out of a place of security. You look around, it's pretty clear that we humans don't love people very well. Well, we're not very great at it. Like, I love people that I like. That's not very difficult. The people that I don't like, I just don't like them. Like, I grew up in Ohio. There are people who live north of us. Not that far north, not up here. Michigan, right? Like I tell people, I treat all kinds of conditions, including people who cheer for the Wolverines. Right? They're just people. No, I have a hard time loving people because there is some part of me that has yet to be loved. The reason that I don't love well is not just because I'm not good at it. I'm not good at it because there is some part of me that has been reluctant to allow you to love me. And we are even less capable of that than we are of loving. But loving is just one form of creating beauty and goodness in the world. God gets intimate when he decides that he's going to create the way that he does. But he then says, after this creation on the second page of the Bible, he then says, as it turns out, it's not good for me to leave the man alone in the way that I've made him. Yes, he senses, then he makes senses of what he senses. Now he's going to name the animals. But having all these animals is not enough for him. I'm going to make him a helper. I'm going to make someone because it is not good for the man to be alone. We're going to come back to that notion of alone over and over and over again in the course of the rest of the night and tomorrow, because each of us in this room have significant acreage of neural networks that represent parts of our stories that are still alone. And the reason I know it is because that's why people end up in my office. And so when God decides he's going to create a companion, he's going to create a relationship. Notice, I'm thinking, why don't you just, look, there's plenty of mud around, right? There's plenty. Why don't you just, make another person out of mud? What's with the surgical intervention? There was no signed release, right? Adam he's walking along, next thing you know, he's waking up with a chest wound. All creative endeavors involve a wounding. The difference is the intention of the one who creates. There's no act of creativity that does not involve a wound. The question is what our intention is and the attunement that we have to the one who is wounded when it happens. Notice, God caused him to fall into a deep sleep. The first act of general anesthesia. And we know what the purpose is because when Adam awakens, he awakens with poetry on his lips. He doesn't come out of his sleep groggy. He doesn't come out of his sleep irritated. He comes out of his sleep amazed. You know, parents wound children all the time in ways that they need to be wounded because the child wants to do whatever the child wants to do, and the parent sets limits. And the child doesn't like this. And what the parent is doing is wounding the child, if you're with me. But they're doing it with an intention of the child's well-being because they are creating safety for the child in terms of the child's need to learn about their own internal impulses. Are you with me? There is a certain sense, if I'm the 3-year-old and you're not letting me have the juice when I want it, how I want it, I'm offended. Are you with me? Hopefully, by the time I'm 30, I will be grateful for this. But this is the point. Creative acts always involve some kind of wounding for the purpose of creativity, not for the purpose of trauma. And then we find you get to the end of the second page of the Bible, and things are culminating. Because here we have the man and his wife were naked and unashamed. They stand on the precipice of their role to steward the world. They're prepared, though naive, to create beauty and goodness, to create and curate beauty and goodness in the world. And this is another important element about what it means for us to imagine that the God who is in this room right now, inviting us to be curious about what he's doing in the room right now. Remember that? We're like, where are we? What he wants is to know from us where we are in relationship to these 3 things. First of all, that the man and his wife, they're differentiated. They're different parts. I would much rather make things with people who are exactly like me. Amen? I've been married for 36 and a half years to Phyllis, and I mean, I don't deserve my marriage. I don't deserve my wife. There's anything that's good about my life as an adult has her fingerprints all over it, for which I'm grateful. And I have to admit, that, you know, I don't know, 6 days, weeks into it, you know, I discovered, like, I thought I wanted to marry Phyllis. And then I discovered I didn't want to marry Phyllis at all. I wanted to marry me. I wanted me to look like her. Don't get me wrong. Believe me, if I'm going to be naked with someone, I want to be with her, not... Just to be clear. But this is the point. Like, I wanted to be with someone who thinks like me, who acts like me, all the things. The whole notion of being differentiated. We as human beings, males and females, most, like when you look at brain function and so forth, by far, the vast majority of that brain territory is the same. But where we are different, we are infinitely different. The Japanese-American painter Mako Fujimura, who many of you may be familiar with his work, this Nihonga, this Japanese art form, like it is what it is primarily because it has differentiated parts. It's not just one thing. But not only that, we're learning from what we call internal family systems. Some of you might be familiar with this way of thinking about our inner lives. We learn that each of us have different parts of us. Like there's a part of you that's angry, and the part of you that's really funny, and the part of you that is shy, and the part of you that is sad or ashamed. All these different parts. The part of you that's an athlete, the part of you that's an administrator, and the part of you that is all these different things. And there are different parts of you that you would rather be dead than be in the room. There are parts of us that we want to get rid of. Parts of us that we're ashamed of, and we don't want to hear from them ever again. And I want to invite you to consider that those are the parts for whom Jesus is coming. It is his mission to bring differentiated parts into an integrated whole. And so the man and his wife were naked. We are the only animals that have to wear clothing in order to survive, right? And, I know that there are animals on which we put clothing. That's weird. Okay, there could be people here that put like clothing on their dogs and things like. I got space tomorrow to talk if you want to do that. We walk around thinking that we're going to choose to be vulnerable. That's not the option. We are vulnerable creatures. The question is, in what way am I going to allow God to use my vulnerability as a way to create? We never create beauty and goodness ever any more powerfully than when we do out of the states of vulnerability that are just who we are. The man and his wife, differentiated and linked parts, were naked and they were unashamed. There are all kinds of things that the Hebrews could have said in that last sentence. They could have said they were naked and happy, they were naked and confident, they were naked and anticipating, they were naked and unafraid. There were all kinds of reasons why they're using that word instead, not least of which they're letting us know about what's coming. And what you get in the next page of the Bible, you get human beings just like us. And we find that this beautiful symphonic enterprise that God has entered into is about to go south in a really, really quick hurry. And it's interesting because it all begins with a conversation. And if you notice, again, these writers are brilliant. When you notice the nature of the conversation begins by telling us who the actor is, that the actor is a snake, is a serpent who's the craftiest of, shrewd. This would be the word for, the English word of shrewd. He's smart. Evil is the second smartest force on the planet, far smarter than anybody in this room. And part of how evil is smart is it is subtle. It's not going to show up tomorrow at 3 o'clock and ask you to go rob a bank. In fact, evil is only ever parasitic. It waits for God's goodness to show up and then it joins the parade. You know, you have the next thing that you want to do, the next new enterprise you want to begin, the next new business you want to start, the next new academic enterprise. And the minute you're wanting to think to do this, now you're anxious that it's not going to be good enough. We're worried about who's not going to like me or like it. There is a reason why evil is called throughout the texts of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, why it's called the accuser. Now, what's so interesting about it is that evil doesn't really have to work all that hard because he has lots of collaborators, many of whom are in this room. Because most of how evil traumatizes us is through shame, and we actually do more shaming of ourselves than anybody else does. And it works something like this. You'll notice that the conversation between the serpent and the woman was just oddly moving along when he says, is it true? And then he goes on to talk about God quite a bit, what God said, what God did, and what God didn't say, and so forth and so on. And what we might start to notice is that even though he's talking an awful lot about God, he's letting her believe things about herself. I had a patient who, when she was 19, this person's now in her 60s, when she was 19, she got a phone call from her father. She lived in the Northern Virginia area. She got a phone call from her father who said to her, I'm leaving your mother and moving to Seattle, where I have another family. Now, this was back years ago, before the internet, before you could know where people were and how they were and so forth and so on. He didn't just have one, he had two children from another woman. And then he said to his 19-year-old who was in college, he said, "But don't worry, it's not your fault." Now, what he wasn't able to comprehend was that, as far as she was concerned, it was only her fault. Because if you're a guy who could leave and move to Seattle, how is it that I'm not enough to keep you here? The serpent is essentially saying to the woman, it's not just that God's worried about you becoming God. The message is, you're not really enough to become God in the first place, which is why he won't let you have the fruit. We know the story and we know what happens. And even though it's just a conversation, no firearms were discharged, nobody was murdered, but there are certain things that all traumas have in common. And they don't have to be grandiose, they don't have to be horrific, although many of them are, and many in this room have experienced them. The two pillars on which trauma stand are the following. Number one, that when I'm in the middle of something that feels traumatizing, I am overwhelmed by it. I'm emotionally, I'm affectively overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. I'm confused. But the second pillar is that in my overwhelm, I also do not have any agency at my disposal to make any difference in this. Now, we might say, well, Curt, isn't that like same thing? We're just talking about two different ways. Well, my daughter, when she was in the third grade, was walking down the hall of her small Christian school when, for some reason, the lockers that were bolted to the wall decided they were just going to leave their moorings. And over they came, on top of Rachel. And there's my third grader. I wasn't there. I might have filmed it if I were, just to see what was like to have this happen. And somebody started shouting at the end of the hall, like, the lockers are on Rachel. The lockers are on Rachel. She was overwhelmed, but she was not without agency. There are moments when we can be overwhelmed by things, but we still have agency. But trauma is what happens when I'm overwhelmed by something, and I also have no agency to act upon it. And I have no agency either to call for help from someone else to come and act upon it. Now, if you're growing up in a house in which you're 9 years old and you come with the first 90% you've ever had on your math test to your dad, and he asks the question, where's the other 10%? Now, we might see this as like normal parenting. Yeah, I grew up with that. Like, this isn't trauma. This is like life in Mount Pleasant, Ohio. But here's the thing. For the 9-year-old brain, he is suddenly overwhelmed with a certain sense of embarrassment. Are you with me? Now, there's nothing that he can do about the embarrassment because the embarrassment is not coming from him, it's coming from his father. He can do all kinds of other things to leave the scene. He can do all kinds of things to make up for that. But it is still a case in which he feels overwhelmed and he does not have agency to change it, except that he's just going to double down and work harder. And the next test, he's going to have a 92, and the next test, he's going to have a 98. And by the time he's a senior in high school, he's making straight A's. He's making straight A's in college and still telling himself, I am not enough. This is the story that we tell because I have to do this some way to cope with the narrative, with the emotional state that I'm having underneath. These kinds of things can happen in all sorts of ways that don't require trauma to be the things that everybody else can identify. The real question, though, is what does trauma then do to us going forward? And here are some other things that are important for us to know. We've talked about the orchestra, and we've talked about the conductor. One of the first things that trauma does is that it really eliminates the conductor from being on the stage. Trauma doesn't just shatter my story. Trauma shatters my capacity to perceive what has actually happened to me. The 9-year-old is not going to say, Dad, excuse me, did you see your therapist today or not? The 9-year-old is not going to perceive this. The 9-year-old is going to perceive there's something This feels bad. I'm going to work harder to cope with this. Not unlike the woman with the fruit, right? Part of what happens is the serpent has a conversation, and part of her choosing, taking, and consuming beauty, not receiving it, taking it, is because it is a coping strategy for her to cope with what's just happened in the conversation, with the wound. This is a different kind of wound than what we saw in the page before. And so what trauma does is it makes it really difficult for me then to imagine what my story is really about. By the time that boy is 18, his story is, it doesn't matter how hard I work, I just know I'm not a good enough son. I just need to work harder. That's the story. The story is not, actually you feel bad because your dad has his own insecurities and he has foisted them upon you. That's how it is that you feel ashamed. You're actually not ashamed because you're not working hard enough. In fact, you're working as hard as one possibly can. That's not where your shame comes from. But he tells a completely different story. How many of us tonight are telling stories that, though subtly, are still categorically untrue about who we are? There are parts of us that are telling parts of our story that are true. There's a part of me that loves God and believes that God loves me. But I can tell you that in the last 3 years, I've discovered the part of me that believes categorically that God is a tyrant. My father died when I was 17 from heart disease. My parents were in their mid-40s when I was born. My brothers were 18, 16, and 11. And so I came along. My 18-year-old brother went off to college, and the next week I was born. And he came home at Thanksgiving and asked, "What is this?" All three of my brothers have passed from cancer. And I've learned to hate it. But even more so, I've learned that there were all kinds of things about my family that we couldn't say until everybody else was dead. Are you with me? And these are things that we have to burn energy containing, energy that is then not available for us to create the beauty and goodness in the world that is waiting for us before the foundation of it. The gospel intends not just to heal us. The gospel intends to heal the way we imagine healing even is supposed to happen. This one last thing I'll mention before I wrap up. There's nothing that we do as human beings that we first do not imagine before we do it. If I'm going to walk across the floor, there is a part of my brain that is committed to imagining that the floor will hold when I do. Everything that we do with intention, first we imagine. Trauma shatters our capacity to imagine. Trauma wounds our capacity to take risks. It shears off our sense of being secure because first we're not safe, because before that we certainly weren't soothed because nobody saw us. It is evil's intention to make sure that we're not seen, that we're not soothed, that we're not safe, and by all means making sure that we do not create beauty and goodness in the world. This can end up feeling like really despairing news. But the reason that we're here is because of the King. And the King is someone who has come to redeem and renew everything that has happened. And how that takes place in such a way that not only are our minds healed, but our brains are renewed and our communities are strengthened, is what we will talk about tomorrow night. I'm going to stop with that. You've been a lovely audience. Thanks so much for your attention.
Dr. Thompson, thank you. That was just an amazing journey. Thank you. There are two metaphors that were in my mind. One was that you've held up a mirror for us to look at ourselves, see ourselves looking back, being aware that we're looking at ourselves, seeing ourselves looking back, and being thankful for that, for the image that you've given us. And you've taken us on a journey into understanding who we are and maybe giving us a deeper sense of where we're at the moment. So thank you. It's really been a wonderful evening. All right, friends, so we have an opportunity to engage in the conversation together. We have mics there, so please make your way to a mic if you'd like to ask a question. For those of you who are online, there's the opportunity to send in an email to questions@regent-college.edu. Just remember to keep your question succinct. Restrict yourself to one question, which means no multi-part questions like I have one question with 18 parts. Part one is such and such, so that's it. And please don't give a mini lecture of your own. Other than that, please come and ask a question. So, who would like to go first? Thank you.
The implications of what you say are interesting, because if Jesus was fully human and fully God, which we Orthodox would believe, then do we not have some problems here? I mean, to say that if Jesus then would have experienced everything you say we experience with our brains, etc., Jesus was raised by a single mother. Did he not then long for his father? And if he longed for his father, wouldn't his inner child be longing for his father's hugs and communication, therefore affecting his way he ministered to his disciples? And if that's the case, and he can't bear our sympathies and all that kind of stuff, is there something lacking in his personality? Or can we say that he didn't experience that? If he didn't experience that, was he really human? I guess that's my question.
Well, I'm really grateful for starting with something simple. So it's a great question, and I think that we won't be the first room that asks questions about, was Jesus enough of God or was he enough of human? One of those two things. And we are not the first to debate this. It took the early church 200 years before they kind of got around to agreeing on certain things. But I will say this. Usually, when I ask a question like this, and these would be questions that would become in my own mind, I think that I'm asking that question primarily, and I'm not saying that this is true for you. What's your name, by the way? Guy. Great to meet you. That is your situation. So here, I will say this. I will say that there are few things that have to do with those kinds of metaphysical questions that I think that are crucially important, that for me do not boil down to questions of attachment. In other words, the things that I worry about Jesus being not enough of one thing or another, or concerned about too much of this or too much of that, ultimately, for me, has a lot to do with the worry that is in the back of my head that somehow I'm not going to have enough of this or enough of that. There's going to be something about the story that is going to pull something out of me that is going to think, well, I'm going to imagine that Jesus, therefore, isn't enough to bear my sin, or isn't something of that nature. But I'd have to say that even my making that assumption doesn't come from nowhere. Like, I make, at some level, and this is where I would say, I think that I'm a big Trinitarian fan. It's been really helpful for me, and it actually helps me reflect on questions like this. We know that people can have tragic stories. People can have tragic developmental stories, and all they need is one securely attached relationship, and they kill it. Not literally. I don't mean violently. You know what I mean, right? Right. So what I'm suggesting is that the evidence of Jesus' life would seem to indicate that this was a guy who was securely attached to his father. It would seem to indicate that. We can kind of like backtrack the history and say he's got a single mom and he's in this and he lost his dad apparently at some. I mean, he's like Joseph at some point, and we can make assumptions about that, but we don't know. But what we are looking at is a guy, and this would be a great set of questions. I would like, dude, like, how did you do? I probably wouldn't call him dude, but like, I would want to know, like, what was it like for you? And I would say that he would want to turn the question and say, well, wait a minute, let's like, what's going on within you that's prompting the question, and how will knowing the answer to that question be helpful for you? And I think at the end of that, I would say, I think there are parts of me that are deeply convinced that at the end of the day, you're not coming for me. And so it becomes easy for me to, like, that's the thing that I see in just about everybody's story I look at. And I'm going to be looking for that. I'm going to be looking for that in Jesus' story. I'm going to be looking for that in Paul's story. I'm going to be looking for that everywhere. Tomorrow night, we're going to talk about how, in my view, what happens in the confessional communities that we're going to talk about doesn't just change the information at our disposal, it changes what we're paying attention to in terms of what information is even important, and how that's changing the way we are able to create beauty and goodness in the world. But a question like yours would be sitting right at the center of that, because of all the pain and all the angst, all the distress that is behind that, the grief that is there, which I honor. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
It struck me as you were talking about how trauma adjusts our ability to imagine the future, especially imagine a future of creating.
Right.
And I wonder what you think about dreams. I mean, literal dreams. Because it strikes me that our dreams are often about a future, an unknown future. How should we, what do you want us to pay attention to in our dreams and how it relates to trauma and creativity?
Well, would you like first to talk to us about your dreams?
One-on-one.
Yeah, okay. So the research community, like people who spend time with these things, with dreams, there is a range of response. You may know this. There's a range of response, right? There are neuroscientists in the world who would say that dreams are nothing but synaptic firing that doesn't know what it's doing in the middle of the night. It's just trying to like discharge stuff, take care of business, take the trash out. That's all it's got nothing to do with reality. And then there are others on the other side of the spectrum who would say, I mean, everything that happens in every dream has some kind of significance. Then most people that I know who do this work are somewhere in the middle of the road, and they like most things that take place when I'm awake, would say, oh, life is largely about discernment. Life is largely, like, we pay attention to certain things, and those certain things, like, we say, oh, that's important, I'm going to pay attention to that. That happened, I'm not going to pay attention to that. Are you with me? Here's an example. So like I said, I've been married for almost 37 years, and there are moments when I or Phyllis might say something or do something that would, like, irritate the other. You know, it's happened once or twice. And there are moments when that happens, when everything else being equal, if I'm in a space where I'm feeling, generally speaking, seen, soothed, safe, secure from other sources, I can hear that and it just goes right by me, and I'm choosing not to pay attention to that moment. You with me? And then there are other moments when I become like a 4-year-old, right? And that's all I'm paying attention to. But it's not just because I'm being a 4-year-old. There are other things that are happening that are shaping that. And so when it comes to dreams, we might say, oh, there will be certain things that you will pay attention to with dreams, and you can make as much or as little out of that as you want to. The question is like, well, is this important? Is not this important? Like I was like, well, in what way is this important to you? And you can be curious about that. Does that make sense? And you can do that as much as you want. That could end up being a full-time job, right? And that would be your choice. I think it's fair to say, though, that all kinds of things that we sense and image and feel and think, whether we're conscious or not, are worthy of paying attention to and then being curious about what does this mean in the story that I'm trying to tell more truly about my life.
Maria has a question from an online person, I think. Is this true? Come on up.
Thank you. This question comes to us from John, and he's wondering if you could speak about neurofeedback therapies, such as a mind lift, either on its own or in conjunction with psychotherapy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there are, we would say that, I was telling my friends earlier that in medical school and residency, not only did I not have a single course, I didn't have a single lecture on what is the mind. Wait for it. Right, you recognize, like, why, how is it that you're a psychiatrist, but you're not really actually identifying what the mind is? I figure if you're an orthopedic surgeon, you know what a bone is. Mm-hmm. You've seen one, you know what an osteocyte is, you know what it means when it's fractured, you know what it means when it's infected, so forth and so on. It's odd that in most medical school curricula, the whole notion of exploring what do we mean by the thing that we are allegedly treating isn't something that we actually define before we start down this path. Having said that, when we talk about the mind in the language of interpersonal neurobiology, that little definition that I gave you, what we're really talking about is a complex system, and we know that that system flourishes. It is flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, stable. It flourishes under certain conditions. And those conditions are what it looks like for that mind to be integrated. Differentiated parts that are linked together, both anatomically and in terms of our function. We have what we like to talk about, these 9 different domains. We didn't talk about this tonight. These 9 different domains of integration that include memory and our narrative domain and our conscious domain and our state domain. All kinds of things that are important in terms of how the mind functions. But if we're growing up in worlds in which none of these domains receive attention, it's going to be difficult for us to have an integrated mind. One of the primary things that things like EMDR, mind lift, brain spotting, neurofeedback do, that they share in common, is that they move the brain and therefore the mind to a more integrated state. That means that I'm actually better able to, in the moment, be aware of what I'm aware of. I'm actually better able to be aware that I'm sensing and imaging and feeling things, and yet pausing long enough to observe, be open to that, and then make a decision about how I'm going to respond in real time and space, as opposed to those things just simply being things that I'm reacting to. So a couple that I saw, they came in one day after a fight. It's the best time to see couples, after they've had fights. There's all that energy in the room. And they'd had a fight the day before, and in their kitchen, and in the middle of the fight, the husband leaves the kitchen, leaves the house, goes in, gets in his car, and takes off. Now, of course, this was not helpful communication strategy. Now, in the office the next day, he is able to say, look, I needed to leave because I didn't want to lose my temper. And I was getting close to that. I didn't want to lose my temper. And I know how she gets when she loses hers, and I didn't want to be in the room when that happened either. So this is what he's saying, and it's true. It's not untrue that this is the case. This is what he was not saying. He was not saying, well, I realize that when I was 10 years old, and my father decided that he was no longer going to drink, but didn't enter recovery, then just started to come home angry every night. And by the time I was that age, I started to notice that when it was about time for him to come home, I would get on my bicycle and I would leave the house. And I would be gone for a good 30 minutes before things would cool off when he would get home. And then by the time he was 16, he would get in his car and he would take off before his dad would get home. Because he doesn't want to be in the house where all the anger is. Are you with me? And so what he's not saying to me is, I'm actually having an implicit memory in which my leaving to go get in the car in the middle of a fight with my wife is actually a memory of what I was doing when I was 10. My 10-year-old showed up in an adult's body and got in a car as a way to regulate my terror of what's about to happen in the kitchen. Because he still feels like he's 10. One of the things that these options will provide is a way for us to learn how to be in that space of emotional state and regulate that more effectively. One of the things that we'll talk about tomorrow night is this whole notion that we said the social engagement system. One of the things that it does is that it helps us co-regulate our affective states. In order for us to regulate distress, when the human brain is left by itself, when you're left alone to regulate distressing emotional states, you will regulate it as expeditiously as possible. You will reduce it as fast as you can. If I'm really anxious before a test tomorrow, the quickest way for me to do that is I'm just going to go play video games, right? And I reduce my distress quickly. Tomorrow, I pay a different kind of price for that. But now, I'm just reducing my distress very, very quickly. If you come to me and say, hey, Curt, let's go study for that test together, my distress does not reduce as quickly, but tomorrow I have different outcomes. Because I'm co-regulating my affect. This is what infants do. They learn to co-regulate by the use of their parent's brain to the point where we hope that when they're 19 years old and they're in Safeway and they're upset, they don't fall down on the floor and have a tantrum. Because they have learned to co-regulate, and then with that, they then practice and they take their parents with them. When he's 3 years old and he goes off to preschool, he's taking his mom and dad with him in his brain. He doesn't know that he's doing this, but this is exactly what he's doing. The problem is that if he has parents who are not actually doing the work of paying attention to his mind, he doesn't get the opportunity to learn how to co-regulate his mind-body matrix. Notice, evil was really, like, why doesn't evil in the third page of the Bible, why doesn't evil say, hey, I got a question for you, but we're going to wait for God to get around here later this afternoon so the four of us can talk together? Like, evil doesn't want any of that co-regulation stuff going on. Remember, he's the smartest, second smartest thing on the planet, right? He isolates her, vicariously isolating her husband. And by the time God comes walking in the afternoon, their trauma has already changed their memory of the command that God gave them. They don't think they're going to die. They think God's coming to kill them. And so they assume certain things, and they have no one to help them co-regulate at the moment. Those kinds of works help strengthen our brain's capacity to do this, but they don't do it by themselves. There's still going to be requirements for people to have other people who are with them to help them regulate.
So, where does deliberate choice to kind of just be like, screw it, come in here? Like, because I deal with a lot of, how do I want to put this? I guess I know all the right things to do to help myself with shame and things like that. I've been to a lot of therapy. And I'm just wondering, like, what's going on when we deliberately say, I know what to do, but I'm just not going to do it. Like, is that shame? Is that trauma? Where does that come from?
Well, I'll offer this reflection. How many here are really kind of impatient with God's timing? You want to say, okay, look, like, what the heck? I think you're probably pretty fast. You could probably win every 100-meter dash at the Olympics. Why so freaking long? Are you with me? And there is a sense, I think, in which if we were to take God seriously enough to actually ask him that question, my guess is that he would say, I think I'm taking so long because I'm waiting for you. I think that we take ourselves not nearly as seriously as God does. I think we take our actions that are leading to the new heaven and the new earth not nearly as seriously as God does. In John 21, when Jesus continues to ask Peter the question, do you love me? Was it 3 times? Was it 33 times? Was it 133 times later in the afternoon? Was this a question that Peter continued to contend with? I would guess it probably was. Because it doesn't just represent a thing that Peter did 6 weeks ago when he threw Jesus under the bus. It represents something, a part of Peter that he believes is true about who he is, that I'm not lovable. The part of me that threw him under the bus is the part that is not lovable, believes he's not lovable, and it's going to take a long time for that part to be convinced that he is. And that's going to require that part to live as if Jesus loves him. This gets back to the thing like, we have a really hard time allowing ourselves to be loved. And so when there are those parts of us that do things deliberately, we like to say that we are people of great longing and we are people of great grief. And the grief that we have is an ocean of grief. You don't just carry your own. You carry yours and your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents to the 3rd and 4th generation. If you're serious about following Jesus, if you're serious about allowing him to see all the different parts of us in order for us to create beauty and goodness in the world in all the work that we do, not just in theology, not just by, look, we're trying to become professional human beings. This is what we're trying to do. And that means if I'm an engineer, if I'm an architect, if I'm a truck driver, if I'm a farmer, if I'm a pastor, if I'm a theologian, I'm in the world to bear and renew the image of God by creating beauty and goodness in the world. And there are parts of me that are not yet ready to believe that that's the case because they're too afraid. I tell people, look, life is actually very simple and extraordinarily difficult. But it is not difficult because it's complicated. It's difficult because of how much shame and fear we walk around with. And they are ubiquitous. And so we talk in these confessional communities, and we'll talk about this tomorrow night, about this whole notion of perseverance, about continuing to come back over and over and over to the part of me that still doesn't believe. I believe, help thou my unbelief. This is the Father in Mark 9. And I just want to say to the young woman who asked the question, I just want to say, you are not by yourself in how maddening it can feel that there are parts of us that are yet afraid to allow Jesus to love them. We're afraid. And we have so buried our fear, we don't even know that's what's going on. Until, as we'll talk about more tomorrow night, until we discover that there are other people in our lives who, when they start to tell their stories, also start to reveal parts of ours that we didn't know that we didn't know.
It looks as if we have 3 people standing over there. Or can we keep doing this, do you think?
I'm not going home for 2 days, so
Yeah.
we can stay as long as we want.
Well, but the question is, how long do these people want to stay?
Right. Yeah.
So let's say these are the final 3, no more, and maybe we could make them shorter answers.
Shorter
we
answers.
can manage that. So
Paul, you are an administrator, aren't you? That's well said.
It's one part of me. There's
I'll
many
do. It's
parts.
one part of you.
You know.
Nicely played.
I heard that somewhere.
You're still talking, Paul.
Thank you so much. This jumps off a little bit about what you just said at the end there, but One of the occupational hazards of hanging around Regent College for a long time is that I am friends with and know and interact with tons of pastors. The past couple of years have been hard on everybody. I feel, and maybe this is I'm partial to all these pastor friends, that it's been particularly hard on pastors, and we've seen the emergence of deep wounding come out of many of our church leaders recently. And I wonder if you could speak to what, may be a spurious connection only in my head, but I will put it out there, that often deeply wounded people find themselves in church leadership and then trying to shepherd a group of deeply wounded people. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you contextualize trauma in church leadership and the ways we're seeing it play out, particularly in a fairly contentious societal context as well. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, in the spirit of Paul's invitation for brevity, I'll say 2 or 3 things quickly. First, from where I sit, I don't think anybody has a harder job in the world than that of being a pastor. There are a whole range of structural reasons for this, but largely it's because I would say that the degree to which pastors find themselves in places of isolation is a big deal. And so that's just for starters. I mean, it sets people, I don't care how healthy they are, they're already set up in such a way that the thing that they do more than anything else in their life is actively disintegrating to their mind, structurally, right? Number one. Number two, COVID was not just the cause of things, it simply pulled the curtain back on things that were already there. And at the same time, it was also actively pretty traumatic to people. I would say the response that I would give for pastors is the response that we'll talk about tomorrow night, which is the response that I would give to everybody. I think that they just have a more concentrated, more distilled version, in many respects, of what everybody in this room wrestles with. It's just that pastors don't have the conveniences that many of us do. They can't hide out nearly as easily because so much of their life is on public display in everything that they do. But we'll talk about that more tomorrow night. How was that?
Pretty good.
Thank you for your lectures. You touched on trauma inhibiting our ability to imagine, and I was wondering what your thoughts are within that connection, if imagination has an ability to heal trauma.
In fact, it does. I'll just be real quick. I mean, if you want to join me tomorrow night up here, you and I can do that lecture tomorrow night. Because one of the things, so here's, my wife is a child development specialist, and she likes to talk about the notion that one of the things that parents do is that they interpret the world for children. That's what parents do. Parents, teachers, we interpret the world for them because kids can't otherwise know what it is. This is a fundamental developmental reality then in all walks of life, no matter how old we are. I go off to medical school. Somebody else is in charge of interpreting reality for me. Somebody else is imagining the world for me while my imagination catches up. Are you with me? This is how all creativity happens. We watch someone else imagine something, and we imagine in a way to catch up with them. One of the things that trauma does is it isolates us. Shame tends to have us turning away from others. I don't naturally go to someone frequently. Trauma has me turning away, which means I'm not necessarily going to be moving toward people whose imaginations I can borrow from in the middle of my trauma. What we'll talk about tomorrow night is the way that confessional communities create space for imaginations to heal as a first step toward the renewal of creating beauty and goodness. And it really speaks to the very question that you're talking about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. You started your lecture talking about being present and how, because anxiety is kind of a future-oriented state, that being present kind of disables some of that power. Mm-hmm. But there's also things that are forward, like hope, And how do we hold and balance being present and the value of that with both reflection on the past and being hopeful and looking towards and anticipating the future?
So I don't mean to sound mercenary, but like I have a new book that's coming in August. And the title is The Deepest Place, Suffering and the Formation of Hope. Because and we're going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow night. There are, when it comes to time, we don't have much of here tonight. When it comes to time, there are generally, we like to talk about two tracks that the mind runs on. Track one is, again, as we said, we have the capacity to imagine time in ways that, as far as we know, no other animal does. Track one, when I imagine the past, I'm usually imagining it, and this is where shame is usually occupying most of this track. When I imagine the past, I'm imagining regret. I'm imagining my grief. I'm imagining my sadness. I'm imagining all the things that if I had only done this, if I had only done that. I think you follow me, right? And here's the thing. It doesn't take much effort on my part at all to get there. Pretty automatic. Are you with me? In the future, it is about being anxious. It is about ruminating. It is about worrying. In both cases, shame is really sending the cognitive message that I'm not enough. I'm not okay. This is the message that the woman got in Genesis 3 before she eats any fruit, and then got compounded afterwards. That's track one. It's automatic, it's fast, we get there very quickly, it doesn't take any effort, and there's no train station. It's just a track, and the train runs continually, back and forth and back and forth. Track two, when it comes to the past, I'm reflecting on the past. I'm looking at the past with intention toward reintegration. I'm being curious about the past. I'm not looking at the past anxiously. Shame is not in charge of this imagination. I'm actually being curious because I want to know what happened in order for me to then do something different in the future. Are you with me? When it comes to the future then, I'm in a planning stage. This is what I'm going to do in the future. That's different than rumination. I'm on a planning stage, and that planning and that reflecting is also different for two other reasons. Number one, there's a train station, and I have to get on that track on purpose. And it takes effort to do that. It's effortless. It doesn't take any work at all to be on the first track. It takes work to be on the second track, number one. But number two, I'm much more effectively able to do it if I'm not doing it by myself. And this gets back to, again, what we'll talk about tomorrow night, this notion that it's not good for the man to be alone is a big deal, and why Trinitarian theology is so daggone important. Is that beautiful? Okay, good. Okay.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Thompson. Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, for that. We've really appreciated your time with us this evening. Dr. Thompson will be available for a few minutes in the bookstore to sign some books and to chat. Maria is going to escort him out right after we're done here so that no one sort of stops him in the hall. She's going to interfere and make sure he gets to the bookstore. The mission of Regent is facilitated by the generosity of friends such as yourselves. So we invite you to consider making a donation as you leave. There's a box over there for cash donations, and there's a QR code for you to connect with your phone. And if you are online, you can make a donation if you'd like to at rgnt.net//give. And all funds donated will go to supporting our students. So that brings us to the end of our evening together. Thanks so much for coming. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow at 11:30 in the daytime, and again at the same time here in the evening. Thank you for coming. Good night.